All right. Well, welcome to the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'm here, Chris Mamoni, your host, and I wanted to share with you guys that are new here. This podcast is dedicated to your space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights to guide you along your healing journey. Together, we'll explore the hidden gifts, lessons, and blessings inside grief and empower you to reclaim your life and create an inspiring future. Today, I have a wonderful guest on the show. I think you guys are really going to like her. Her name is Dawn. She has a nursing background. I'm going to introduce you guys to her here in a second. She has mindfully integrated 3 decades worth of nursing experience and combined her insight with her expertise as an advanced grief recovery method specialist and infinite possibilities trainer to help women heal their hearts, transform their lives, and rediscover their joy. Dawn's healing journey led her to a heartfelt mission to help others illuminate their inner light and transition from surviving to thriving. With a compassionate approach, she expertly guides her clients to attain mind, body, and spirit wellness. Dawn is also a best-selling author of Journey to Peace and Healing and Journey to Self-Discovery, 100 Days of Soulful Reflections, as well as a contributing author on multiple best-selling anthologies. So without further ado today, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce Dawn. Dawn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate you inviting me to be a guest on your podcast. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation about grief and how we can, you know, take it from the elephant in the room to something that all of us experience and make it more normal.
I really
So,
appreciate that.
yeah.
That's a big topic. A lot of people think grief is this really heavy thing in the room, like you said, an elephant in the room, and we all just kind of don't discuss it until something happens. And I'm really excited to hear your story today because, as I've learned on my journey, grief is a very individual experience, but it's something that if we talk to people who have gone through grief and hear their stories and what they've learned, it can often be very helpful for us to navigate that grief journey of our own.
Oh, definitely. I think hearing other stories helps us not feel so alone in what we're going through. And I think many times we feel like no one understands. And while they don't understand what we're feeling, they oftentimes have had a similar experience and can be there to support us if we allow it. So I will go back to where my journey began. You had mentioned, I've been a nurse for about 30 years. And I, at the age of 30, saw myself getting divorced, sadly. And that really broke my heart. I didn't know how to navigate that moving forward. And so I found myself experiencing a wide range of emotions. Now I realize it was grief. I had the sadness and wishing that things had worked out differently. I had the anger. And in the middle of this, I was, raising my 3.5-year-old son, and I didn't know how to do that without my partner. So my divorce really led me to start to do some healing of my own. And I didn't really know what that looked like. I started seeing a therapist, and then I, started reading some books, some personal growth books, going to seminars and workshops, and kind of opening myself up and finding parts of me that I didn't know were there previously because I had spent so many years being a wife and a mother and a nurse, but I didn't know who I was beyond that. So as I traveled on my journey, I found there were things that kind of helped take, the edge off of the grief that I'd been experiencing related to my divorce, but I still, something was missing. And I happened upon a program called the Grief Recovery Method. And my partner at that time signed me up because he wanted to go. And he said, "Well, I want you to go to this with me, the certification training." And I said to him, "Well, I don't have any grief." And so I always laugh at that now because I didn't really realize what grief was. Like many people, I thought it was related to just death. And while I had experienced a couple of my grandparents passing away, I hadn't had a really close relationship with them, so it didn't affect me to the degree that maybe other things would have. But when I started this training, I realized the grief was a normal and natural reaction to any significant change or loss in our lives. And so that blew my mind. So I started looking and I thought, oh my gosh, I grew up in an alcoholic home. My dad was an alcoholic. And that was a grieving event. We didn't have the strong relationship that I'd hoped for. And so I struggled with that and I struggled with my relationships. Then I also experienced a physically abusive relationship in my teenage years. And I realized, wow, I have a lot of grief over that, still a lot of anger. And all these things I realized led me to not being able to navigate my marriage in maybe a healthy way. I didn't have those tools, and because I was carrying around a lot of baggage in my heart. And so it was doing the grief recovery method certification and starting to heal my own heart that allowed me to see how I hadn't had those tools to help me have a healthy relationship, or not just a romantic one, but any type of relationship in my life. And once I learned those, it really changed my life. And what I started noticing is there were so many people around me, and especially my patients, were grieving. And I was seeing that so many patients whose physical health issues were getting worse. It was an impact of emotional health issues, different losses in their life. I worked with veterans a lot, and we know that veterans experience things that the majority of us never experience or can even imagine having to go through in our lives. And so it's, that keeping all that grief inside and not being able to talk about it, not having healthy tools to heal, that leads people to having worsening health conditions, physical health conditions, or developing new physical conditions. So I really decided that it was time for me to offer something to others out there that could help them heal their hearts and have a life of wellness versus illness. So that's kind of where my journey began with working with grievers.
I think that's really powerful for you to share that with us today. And
Thank you.
something that stood out in my mind as you were talking, and I remembered when we first met in our pre-interview, that you brought up being a listening heart for people. And
Yes.
I thought that was really impactful. Another thing you shared is that a lot of times you just listen to people. And I think that that's something that, we talked about at length, and I'll give you the opportunity to build off that I brought up being in the lost community as a person that lost a stillborn, and how we don't want to be fixed. We don't want to be told it's going to be okay. We don't want to be told, here's how to go through this, or move on, or you got to let go of it at some point. We don't want to hear those things. And so I found that really powerful that you said, I'm a listening heart and I listen.
Mhm. Yeah, so the thing is, like you already alluded to, is grievers don't want to be fixed. They just want to be heard. They want to feel supported. And the best way that we can support anyone that's going through a grieving experience is to listen. Because as soon as we start offering advice or comparing their loss to our loss, they check out, they isolate, they shut down. So being a listening heart is really choosing to show up, hold space for someone while not judging, criticizing, offering advice, or comparing. Because so often what happens is an individual says, I'm grieving, my relationship's ending, I'm getting a divorce. And someone says, oh, yeah, I got a divorce, but don't worry, in a few years you'll feel better. It just takes time. Or there's plenty of fish in the sea, so you can find another husband or partner. And so these things that we hear end up hurting our heart even more. Our heart's already broken. And now we've reached out to you hoping that you could support us, but what you said just caused more pain. And so that's one of the things I really educate others about is just being a listening heart. People don't need to hear an answer or a response that's going to somehow change things for them because they know at that moment nothing's going to change. But if they can be heard, that's really helpful. Some of the most important things that we can say to an individual are things like, I can't imagine how you feel. And you can say, if you've had the same type of experience, I remember how I felt when such and such happened, but I can't
Mm.
imagine how you feel. And the reason that's important is because even if both of us had the same loss, say we're siblings and we both lost our mother, we both had a unique relationship with her. Your relationship was very special as well as mine, but we don't share the same things with mom, right? We've had different conversations, different life experiences. And so how we grieve and how we feel is very unique. So it's an important thing to remember when we talk to others is we don't know how someone else feels. We only know how we felt when we went through something similar.
Yeah, you touched on a lot of very good topics that I try to help educate people myself through my coaching business that I have. And a lot of topics you hit on today was that people that are going through grief or loss or trauma are very, very vulnerable. It's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. And so we're vulnerable because we're in a place where we feel so many emotions all at once. I know that when I lost my child in particular, in the hospital, I felt happy with him. I don't know why. I smiled all the time. I loved my kid. But when I went home, I was angry. I was frustrated. I was sad, depressed, overwhelmed. I had all these emotions hit me from every single side. And it's very hard for people in that grief space because you're vulnerable at that point, and you're vulnerable not in a dismissive way. You're vulnerable because you're allowing yourself to feel those things. You're giving yourself permission to experience those emotions. And I think what's really hard that you hit on so well, and I appreciate what you said about it, is that when people try to come along and say, "Oh, you'll be fine years later, you'll be okay." Oh, I've been divorced before, you'll be fine.
Mhm.
It's very dismissive to that person going through grief. And when they're vulnerable in that state, especially with people, I can only really relate to this because I'm in the lost community with parents that have lost a child. And that's the hardest thing for us to hear is something like that, and then also at the same time having to be go through that trauma grieving and then hear that it's almost like sets us back and makes that worse. And then what it also does that you alluded to a little earlier is that it makes us want to isolate. It makes us withdraw from people, and then we now come in a place of where we don't feel safe to talk, so now feel like we have to take that grief on our own way and process it internally. And that can cause a lot of problems for people. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with you grieving on your own. I did that myself, by the way. I didn't have help when I lost my son. But to feel like you're in a place where it's not safe for you to reach out to people, it's very sad to me that there's people out there that have that experience because I think that as I've learned on this grief journey I've been on, there are people there that can help you, and there are safe people you can go to that, just like Dawn said today, Dawn's a listening heart. She listens more than she talks with people. I think that's such a beautiful, beautiful gift to give somebody that's going through grief because you're giving them space and you're giving them permission to feel. And I think that's the best gift you can give to somebody that's going through grief.
Oh, I totally agree. It's interesting because when I work with my clients and, they're talking, they're so used to someone responding to them consistently. And I'm just listening. And it's such a different experience for them because they just can continue to allow their emotions to flow, which is the first step in healing, right? To be vulnerable and honest, emotionally honest. And one thing I always bring up is we have this rule. in the grief recovery method about Kleenex. So most of us, when we see somebody crying, we want them to feel better. So we often hand them a Kleenex because we think it's helpful. But the truth of the matter is, when you hand someone a Kleenex, usually it stops or pauses their emotional release. Because many of us think, oh, somebody's handing me a Kleenex, I need to pull myself together, be strong, right? Those myths that we hear, as we're growing up. And so it's interesting to allow people to have their emotions, to express what's going on in their heart, and to not hand them a Kleenex, to not offer, oh, can I, get you a glass of water? Can I get you a Kleenex? Can I do something for you? And just allow them to be. It
Yeah, that's a
really is healing.
that's a beautiful example, like you said. And I appreciate you giving that when we first spoke because I never realized when I've done that for people a lot over the years. I've never consciously thought about it, but when you
Right.
brought that up, it made sense because when you cry, it's an emotional release and you're in
Yes.
that process of things. But if somebody says, "Oh, it'll be okay," or "Here's a Kleenex," you're breaking that emotional train of
Mhm.
thought, and so it's disruptive pattern. Um, I personally in the coaching space, I've been working with a guy who's suicidal in the UK, and when he reaches out to me, the first question I ask him is not to try to fix or solve the problem, but mine is, how best can I support you today? And I leave that door open for him to say. And sometimes he says, I just need somebody to talk to today. Just having a really hard time with my thoughts. Other times it's a flood of emotion that comes through. And
Mhm.
it's a beautiful thing when you give somebody in that space exactly what you and I have been talking about, a listening heart and just saying, how best can I support you? And giving them that control, because that's something that I've noticed too in the grief space is that, we as people, especially men, just speaking from my experience, we're fixers. We want to make sure people are better or good. They're not in that bad place. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that about your own grief journey, by the way, that one of the most common phrases I've used lately with people is, it's okay to not be okay. Have
Mhm.
you, can you relate to that on your grief experience you've had?
Yeah, and that goes back to normalizing grief, normalizing our emotions. And, when you brought up the being happy at the hospital and then coming home and feeling angry and sad and depressed, when we put any of us, ourselves or others, in a box that we should be going through certain stages or emotions, it diminishes our experience. So when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross years ago wrote the stages of grieving, they were the stages of grieving for someone who was dying, not for someone who was actually grieving from the loss of someone, if that makes sense. And so when people say, well, you should be at this stage, or we tell ourselves, well, why haven't I moved on to the next stage? Well, we need to throw those stages out and allow ourselves to be where we are, because wherever you are is okay and it's normal. And when we allow ourselves to be in those spaces, whether it's anger, sadness, fear, whatever it is, then it again helps us heal, because we're not um, beating ourselves up. We're not saying that we're doing something wrong or someone else is. We're accepting where we are in the present moment.
I think that's beautifully said because I've had, I won't say who this is, but I've had somebody in my life tell me, grief is just a part of life. You just have to learn to accept it. And that one really triggers me honestly in a lot of ways. And I'm using it as an example today on this podcast because that's a very big statement to make to somebody who's in the middle of grief. And me personally, I've learned with a lot of people I've worked with that we don't need to come out and say that. Yes, it's a process. Yes, it's a part of life. I get the blunt honesty with that, but it also, writes off that person's experience for where they are today, and it doesn't make space for their emotions and for them to feel. And I
Right.
think that's something else I was going to ask you about too. When you went through your grief journey, something I had discovered on my journey is that grief comes in waves. Did you experience that similar process when you went through divorces and went through those relationships that were turbulent? Did you notice a pattern that some days grief could be a little easier to handle and other days it just was very overwhelming?
Yeah, I definitely noticed that. One thing that stood out was, um, the universe has a way of showing up and telling us where we need to heal. We might think that we've healed something, but then we have a trigger or a messenger show up. And it's like reminding us that you still have some work to do there. You are still really grieving whatever situation it is. And so I would notice that, I would feel fine for a while and then something would happen, something that triggered me, pushed my buttons. And then I would need to look at that and do some more work. And I always look at it as like an onion, peeling an onion. There's many layers. So while we might be ready to do some healing um, on a certain loss, we might not be ready to go to the depth, right? So we can do some of the more surface stuff that's coming up for us, but maybe it's another year before we look at that again and do some more healing. So I do really believe that it is a process that we go through, and the more work we do, the healthier our lives become.
Well, I want to ask you another question too about grief because you brought up the five stages of grief, and I personally looked at those when I lost my grandfather and my son, and I didn't really. I felt like some of them it wasn't a linear process, if you will, because I found myself moving through different stages of that thing, and the best way I can describe it to our listeners today is if you had a five-step process, you might start on step four, jump to step one, jump to step five, two. You might be all over the map with that. Um, you've been a nurse for 30 years, so I want to get your opinion and background on this. But do you think that there's different stages of that five-stage process of grief that was originally there, and are there steps that you would relabel in a sense that make more sense for grief more generically outside of death, do you think, in your experience?
Well, so I just throw out the steps. And the reason is because once I became a grief recovery specialist, I learned that those were really the stages, the steps for someone that was grieving their own death because they knew they had a terminal illness versus someone that was grieving someone else's death. And I don't like how they put people in, categories and labels. I don't like that because everybody's grief journey is unique. So I just meet grievers where they're at, wherever they are in any given day. And, the question you ask grievers, I wanted to bring that up because I think it's so important. How can I support you? That's one of the most loving things that we can say to someone that we care about or a client, anybody in our lives. We use it a lot in actually my household, my partner and I. How can I support you? I know you're going through a difficult time because it just opens the line of communication and it allows someone to ask for what they need. Many of us, it's hard to ask for what we need because we've been trained to take care of others. And I know that's especially hard for men because they've been the ones that, you know, historically provided for their family. I know that's changed a lot in this era, but historically that's how it was. And they were taught to be strong, pull up your big boy pants and be strong and just move forward. So to ask those that we love, how can we support them? It helps them learn that it's okay to trust. It's okay to be honest. It's okay to ask for what we need and to honor ourselves.
I think that's a big point to make in the grief process is that we are set up as people to give, and society has taught us, give, 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 and we don't ever really talk about that selfish side of it. I mean that in a good sense, selfish in the sense of taking care of ourselves,
Yeah.
because it's kind of like the airplane analogy I like to use. Everybody's familiar with it. Is got to put your mask on before you help other people, because if you don't, you might save one or two people, but if you put your mask on, you might save five. It's
That's
you,
true.
and that's something that um I was talking to a guy I interviewed last week on Sunday, and long story short, he got told big boys don't cry growing up. That's what his family told him. And his best friend died in a fire. His other friend went to a sleepover, and somehow the kids got a hold of a gun. The kid got shot in the head. And he held in all this trauma from those things because he got told big boys don't cry. His wife on vacation, they were on their anniversary or something at the beach, and his wife said, "You don't feel. What is that?" And anyway, he decided to actually acknowledge himself. He cried for 4 days straight. And this was like years after this event happened, years beyond it. And I share that example today on this episode because of what we're talking about, that when you're not given space to feel, when you're not given space to explore those emotions, to actually look your grief in the eye and say, this is happening right now in front of me. This is how I feel. It really bottles up inside of us. And then years later, in a different point in life, it'll still come out. Um, I think you've attested to that too when you shared your story with me.
Oh, that's very true. I mean, when we don't allow the pain to come out, and when we don't allow ourselves to experience and feel those negative, we'll label them as negative emotions, then we also block out the good. We block out the joy. And so it's really important that we learn to be emotionally honest. When we stuff our feelings down continually, that's when things start happening in our lives, like addictions, alcohol, drugs, social media, overeating, all those kind of things that we do because we're trying so hard to keep our pain in that little corner of our heart and not let it come out, that we have to do things to help us feel better. And so these short term, fixes like, oh, okay, well, let's have a glass of wine. Let's have two glasses of wine because now I don't feel anymore. We think that that's helping us get better, but it's not. It's actually doing the opposite because we're continually not addressing our pain and heartbreak.
And I think that's what's really challenging for a lot of people that go through grief and loss. I saw it with my friend that I interviewed, and I almost it was almost like living in his mind when I interviewed him. And I saw the pain, I saw the hurt, I saw that he wasn't, and that was just from his experience of what happened. That wasn't even his emotions. We didn't even get there yet. And when he expressed that to me, that he cried, when he expressed to me the night that he tried to commit suicide, when he expressed all those things to me, I saw this huge, just big burst of cry for help. That's what I saw. I didn't see someone with a problem. I didn't see somebody that wasn't reading emotions. I saw this big cry for help when he was sharing the story. And I thought it was so powerful that when we do face those emotions, and they're hard, they're very, very hard. Um, the hardest challenge in my life was when I had to leave the hospital without my son. That was the worst moment of my life. And I can't think about it a lot because it's hard. It's very, very hard. But when it does come up, I allow myself to feel it. And am I going to cry and feel like a gut twist in myself? Oh yeah, I'm going to feel it. But I've learned that the more I open myself up to feeling those emotions and not trying to cover them up and bury them, um, the pain gets a little less. And I don't say it, I don't want to tell anybody it goes away because it doesn't. It does not get, for lack of a better term, it doesn't become easy. It doesn't go away. You're not all fine. But you give yourself that permission and space to feel. And when you do that, the intensity of that emotion comes down a bit. So instead of you having a severe emotional reaction to it, which is where oftentimes we're not allowing ourselves to feel, that's why it's so strong and powerful, is because we ignore it. But when we face it and we put our eyes on it, it becomes a little bit less intense, and then we can start actually seeing, what happened in that moment, and then that gives us the clarity to really say, "This is how I feel. I feel sad. I feel upset. I feel frustrated." And and the anger that comes with that too, that I've learned is, anger is a big part of grief, and I'd love to hear you talk about that as well. That anger is really a secondary emotion. It's not the first thing that people think. Anger covers up those real emotions underneath. I'd love to get your
Yeah,
take on that.
it does. I see a lot of people, and I saw this in myself when I was younger, that anger was like the being strong, the having to keep everything inside, covering up the sadness and the heartbreak and just trying to get through. But I always use this analogy. So we're born and we have this backpack and it's empty. And then the first loss or the first grieving event happens. Maybe it was when, we were in kindergarten and some kid made fun of us or they pushed us and, we didn't know how to deal with that. So that's the first thing. And then all these things build up in that backpack. And pretty soon the backpack is weighing you down. And it's really hard to walk through life. And you might feel this extreme heartbreak and sadness, but it's coming out as anger because you don't know how to express it in any other way. And many of us were taught to be strong. We don't want to look weak. So we're not going to cry. We're going to be angry. And I don't even think it's a conscious choice. It's just that's how it comes out, you know? And it's directed at whoever's in front of us because we don't know how to deal with our emotions that are really trying to pop out and to have a voice, but we haven't allowed them to have that voice.
I think that's really powerful what you said, and I love that you said it's almost unconscious because something that I've caught on to with myself personally, but I see it in a lot of other people, is that because we grew up in our environments, at home, at school, with the job, whatever it is, we all take that in subconsciously. We don't always think about it. And when we do happen to go through grief, oftentimes I think I try to stay away from the word autopilot, but it kind of comes across that way that our reactions to things often fall in that autopilot sense, and where we're not actually even conscious of it, where our body has just in our mind has been trained and taught how to respond in those moments. And so a lot of times, it's why I call grief a personal gateway to transformation, is that when you go through grief, you're on that autopilot a little bit. You're dealing with it the way you've been told to deal with it or shown how to do it. Just like my friend said, big boys don't cry, so he just bottled it up. Well, it became anger and frustration, and then went on a 4-day bender of crying because that was all that pressed up emotion that had been bottled up. Um, so, when we go through grief, I think it's really important on that standpoint to become conscious of ourselves. And
Mhm.
um, I talked to a woman yesterday that she's lost her dad less than a year ago. And I asked her, how is that process going for you of grieving? Are you giving yourself space? And she said, Chris, my family doesn't even want to talk about it. They don't want to express emotion. They don't want me to express emotion. We don't talk about it. And I said, that's got to be really hard for you. And she said, it's hard, but I realized after losing my dad that I need to feel these things. I need to feel these emotions. And I'm seeing a therapist. I'm doing all these things for myself. And I just sat there and said, wow, this person is in this environment that doesn't isn't conducive of feeling emotion, expressing emotion, and even handling that grief. They're just pushing on their carpet. And then here's this generational curse breaker coming along saying, this is not me. This isn't how I deal with these things. I feel stuff. And she gave herself permission to do that. And I thought it was such a beautiful thing about what we were talking about today. That's why I brought this up, is like I love seeing people like that say, I know I was taught this and shown this, and this is what I've been learned behavior, but it's not who I am. It's not how I deal with these things. And when you give yourself permission to feel, I came up with this phrase last week of you start to heal when you start to feel. And
Mhm.
that's not to be cliche, but when you actually feel your emotions and give yourself permission, that's when the healing starts because you're listening to yourself, you're feeling yourself, you're breaking away from these things that hold you back or will hold you back. And that allows you to see that grief process truly as your own. As you said, everybody's grief journey is individual. There is no grief isn't linear. I share that with people a lot. Grief isn't this like perfect line you're going to cruise across and you're going to be fine. It's going to be a whole bunch of up and down harshly, and then maybe it'll level out a little bit. Um, so I just think grief is a very hard personal process.
Oh, I agree. And really what came to me when you were speaking was something we talked about last week when we met, is that, I truly believe that grieving is a gift. Like there is gifts in it. It doesn't feel like it at the time, and it may take years to see it. But like you said, your one client, you know, is breaking some generational curses, right? And choosing differently. Like there's a reason that we're going through these difficult emotions. And through our healing, we get to choose differently. We get to um, become the highest version of ourselves. And we also get to help others. And that doesn't mean that we have to change our professions or anything like that. But our experience can help others. It creates a ripple effect because we can share with the world, with those that we love. We can be more compassionate and understanding. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. That's well said. And I think that's another big aspect of grief that
Mhm.
gets overlooked is that we through that grief process is, like you said earlier about shedding an onion, like peeling back the layers of that onion and really uncovering who you are. And I think a lot of people in the grief process, to build off that, because it's something I had to learn the hard way through two that I've been through, is that um, when the part of the reason grief is so uncomfortable is that we're meeting this new version of ourselves, and we don't. I kind of equate it to if you're out there dating somebody, let's just say you meet somebody and you go meet them for coffee or dinner and you've never met this person before. You might have barely had a surface level conversation before you met them and you go meet this person and you always have this, I don't know who this person is. I kind of have an idea what they look like. I'm not sure if we're on the same wavelength as this. You have all these questions going on in your head. You're trying to piece this puzzle together. I kind of tell people grief is a lot like that. You're losing this old self of yours with things that don't serve you anymore. And this new person, though, is a beautiful gift, like you said. But at the same
Right.
time, we sit there and we're in between these 2 points of saying, well, I've given up this part of myself. I want to be over here and I like this thing. It's just weird. And we just have this constant tug of war between our old self and our new self. And I think that's what makes grief really hard for some people, myself included. I'll just say that I had a really hard time with that. But if you give yourself permission to embrace that, that's the beauty of the gift, and
Yeah.
that's where the gift will show you. And like you said too, and I appreciate you saying that, you're not going to see it in the depths of your grief when you're really grieving and things hurt. I want to tell everybody listening to this podcast right now, you are not going to see that gift. Don't try to hunt for it because
No.
you need to give yourself space to heal to that place where you can. And some people, I've watched people heal in 3 months. I've watched people heal in 30 years. I can't sit here and say there's a said timeline you're going to figure it out. It's really a personalized journey for you.
Mhm. Yeah, I would agree that, you can't see it in the midst of the acute grief. It's, I look back on my life and I'm like, oh, now I see why that had to happen. You know, um, I wouldn't be who I am today. I wouldn't be here with the messages that I have to share with the world or be able to help others had I not gone through some of these things. And to think, there's many people, and I thought it until I became a grief recovery method specialist, that I hadn't experienced grief. Well, the truth is 100% of us are grievers. We all experience grieving events throughout our life. So, that's why it's important to normalize it and to learn from it and to allow ourselves to be vulnerable and emotionally honest. That's like one of the most important things we can do, and to find those people who will be the listening heart, who will support us and not leave our side when we're hurting. Because I'm sure that you can relate to this. A couple weeks will pass after something happens and everyone moves on with their life. And then it can feel very lonely. If you've lost a child or a parent or someone else important in your life, everybody shows up at first and they're bringing food and coming over and supporting you. But then as the weeks go on, you're alone. Many of us have felt that way, and that's a really devastating place to be. So it's important to remember to continue to check on people. How are you? You know, I've been thinking about you. Is there something I can do to support you? Just want you to know I love you. Those are such important things to do for those that we care about when they're going through difficult times.
You have you brought it up a couple of times today, and I'm really grateful you did. I wanted to ask if there's somebody listening to this podcast today that is early on in their grief process and maybe just is unsure how to navigate that. Do you have something you could share with them that would help them learn how to be vulnerable with their emotions?
So, I work with a lot of people who have never been vulnerable because they were taught that that was a weakness. And so I encourage people to find those individuals in their life, to reach out there. I know that you can feel very alone when you're grieving, but there are people that, like you and me, that want to be there and support individuals. So I always suggest, take that first step, make that call, reach out to someone that you know can be supportive, and allow yourself to be honest. It's okay. Keeping all that stuff inside actually is going to be more detrimental to you than letting it out. And it's okay to not be emotionally honest with your family and friends if you don't feel safe. You need to be in that safe environment. So find those people that will be safe for you and express what's going on in your heart. Because when your heart's broken, it's one of the best things that you can do is release some of that pain that's been building up.
I think that's beautifully said. I was gonna ask you a question about talking to safe people, but you really covered that really well. And that's something that I found on my healing journey personally, there were people I thought that were safe to talk to. They were not safe people. And I learned the hard way that when you do just reach out to everybody and anybody, and you go through a big trauma like losing a child, losing a parent, and the thing that maybe we can talk about this too, that there are people out there that are going to say hurtful and insensitive things, and they're not really going to see it, by the way, because I've learned that people can empathize with you to the level of experience they have in life, and that can make you also feel kind of isolated because then it becomes, who do I reach out to? Who do I feel safe with? Um, and so I think that, it's really important for people to discover, like you said, find that one person that you feel safe with, that one person that you can be very honest, very open, very transparent with, because that person is going to stick by your side and they're never going to leave you. And that's going to give you a lot of solace in your healing journey, because a lot of times, what I've experienced and I've heard it from a lot of people is that we go through these deep traumas and we open up to somebody and then something insensitive gets said, and it's almost like a setback, and it makes us want to close off and isolate instead of saying, that just wasn't the right person. I need to go find somebody else that I can talk to and feel safe with.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is so important to have those people that are safe because, as you said, one person saying something that feels hurtful when you're grieving is enough to make most of us, completely isolate and not want to talk to anyone else. And that's why I do a lot of educating everyone, my family, my friends, about, you know, the things to say, the things not to say. It's not helpful to say it will get better. And I can't tell you how many times in my life I've heard that. It will get better. Just give it time and you'll feel better. It's frustrating because it totally minimizes someone's current experience and how they're feeling in their heart. It's way more important to just say, I'm here to listen and not say anything else. But most of us are taught that when someone talks, you need to respond. So it's a very big shift to go into that, you know. Because most of us, when we listen, we're thinking about how we're going to respond instead of just listening. But it's really important when we, want to show up for those that we love who are going through grieving experiences, traumatic experiences, to just be able to sit there and hold space and listen.
Well, it's definitely something I've learned in this process, and it's why I created this podcast. Is really, I've noticed how many people have gone through grief, and something you touched on today too that I really appreciated is grief doesn't always have to be associated with death. It doesn't always have to be that. I mean, people, grieve a relationship that ended up in divorce. People grieve that every day and say, I didn't want a divorce, but it happened. And I also talked to somebody last week that said, my mother just, I could never connect with her growing up at all. Still to this day, even after losing my father, I still can't connect with her. And we have a non-existent relationship with that. And that person's grieving that relationship, but that person's
Yes.
still living. Um,
Yeah, there's so
people,
many.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, just I was just gonna say, people grieve, losing a house, losing a job, moving, having to, there's so many ways grief happens in our life, and I think to your point that you brought up today is that we should be normalizing talking about grief and normalize that it's not just death. There's so many aspects of life where this happens. Um,
Oh, I agree. I always talk to people about those good events that happen in our life that are grieving events. Getting married, having a child. Yes, they're happy events, but it's a huge change in your life. And so I always encourage individuals, if you're feeling off, I understand you just had a baby and that's like the happiest moment in your life. And also it's a grieving moment. Like if you are feeling sad and feeling like your life is completely changed and you're not sure if you like it, that's okay. Just be okay with it right now because this is a change and you're grieving what you used to have. It's just like retirement. Everybody gets really excited about retirement, but as soon as they retire, many people lose their sense of purpose and they feel unfulfilled. They don't know what to do with their life because they've just left all these coworkers that probably were friends. They've left a career that maybe they've had for their entire work life. And now they're at home and they're not quite sure how to navigate life. So that's also a grieving event. So it's important to be really graceful with ourselves as we journey through life and realize that anything that signifies change can lead to grief.
I'm glad you just said that because that's where my brain was going as you were talking about things, and you made me realize on a bigger grand scheme of our life, we're always changing, we're always evolving, we're always going through things. And you were making me think about it. I went to college, my life changed. I ended up getting a job and working full time, and then all of a sudden that turned into having a relationship. I've been with my wife for 17 years, and us going through that marriage. And people think marriage is this happy-go-lucky all the time. Marriage is a fight sometimes. And on
Right.
top of that, you're growing, your spouse is growing, your spouse changes, you change, and then you have a child in the picture, that changes everything. Maybe you get a new job or you relocate, that changes things. Your parents are eventually going to pass away. You're going to end up with all these events in life, like you just said, even happy events, marriage and bringing a child in the world is a grief experience. And
Yes.
so um, you were just making me go full circle in my head about this, that if we were to normalize grief and allow people to, instead of saying it's this negative, harsh thing, push it under the rug, don't talk about it, but instead say, this is part of life, but here's how to navigate this. Here's some tips on how to work through this. And here's how to embrace your emotions, your vulnerability, how to work through this in your own terms and understand this is a personal journey for you. I,
Mhm.
I think the whole world would shift on that aspect. I never gave thought to that till you said that today. So I appreciate that, Dawn.
Oh, thank you. So I was just thinking as you were talking about the word fine. So many of us, when we come into contact with somebody, and they ask us, well, how are you doing? I'm fine. I'm fine. And we say it without even thinking about it. And in the grief recovery world, we say fine is feelings inside not expressed. So my partner and I, if I ever say I'm fine, he's like, okay, what feelings are you experiencing that you're not telling me? And it reminds me of when I used to work in a hospital, and there was a sky bridge between the hospital I worked at and the hospital next door. And I'd often take my break and do a little walk because it was like a quarter of a mile. And I'd come across the same people like every week, and they'd say, "Oh, hi, Dawn, how are you?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm fine." And I'd say, "How are you?" "Oh, I'm fine." And one day I stopped and I thought, why am I telling everybody I'm fine when some days I'm not fine? Some days I'm
Mm.
having a really not so good day. I'm never allowing these people to learn who I am. I'm never being vulnerable. Why is that? What am I scared of? Well, I'm scared of they won't want to hear what I have to say. They'll reject me. They won't want to be my friend. But the truth of the matter is, I want people in my life that care about how I'm doing, not ones that just want to hear that I'm fine. And so it's a great reminder for all of us to be emotionally honest, to choose that. I mean, obviously, like you and I have talked about, with safe people, we don't do that with everybody. But if there's relationships that are really important in your life, choose to be vulnerable and take that chance instead of saying you're fine. Say, I'm having a really rough day. I could just use a hug, or I could use someone to just listen to me.
That is powerful, and I just want to reiterate that because that's the first time I've heard that. Because I've had people tell me they're fine over the years. I'm going, you're not fine. I can see it right across your face. You're not fine. Don't lie to me. Like, and like I don't verbally say that sometimes to people because they'll get offended and
Right.
they'll just say, I'm fine, leave me alone. It's like, okay,
Mhm.
like, but I love your expression of that feelings inside not expressed. That
Mhm.
is like the exact definition of the word fine.
Right.
Because like you said, when we say the word fine, I think oftentimes it's a sign we don't feel safe with someone in front of us to be emotionally vulnerable and say something. And that also brings up, like you said, elements of fear and rejection, and somebody might not like this. I've had that over the years, and I think it's trained in me too, because I used to open up to people when I was younger, but then people get really turned off, and I was like, "Oh, you're sharing too much. You're saying this." And to Don's point, if people make you feel that way, it's not safe people. We don't do that with everybody. And so that might be a signal that that person's not safe. But I would encourage everybody today, because I'm going to start doing this. If I ever catch myself using the word fine, it's feelings inside, not expressed. So what are those feelings? I think that's a great way to learn to be emotionally vulnerable too. I think that's a great tool to understand that analogy. I thank you
Mm.
for sharing that today.
Yeah. I mean, because to be honest, most of the time when we say it, we're just barely getting by. Like if we're doing good, we normally say that. I'm doing great today. It's a good day. So a big percentage of the time, the fine is I'm just going to tell you I'm doing fine because I don't want to talk about it. And, I think when we start to look at the relationships in our life and how people interact with us and support us, those that don't want to hear how we're doing, we start to realize who we want in our life, who we want as a part of I call them our tribe. Those are the people that we keep really close. That doesn't mean that we talk to them every day, every month, sometimes not even every year, but we know that they're always there. They have our back. They're like kind of our angels.
They really are. I can attest to that. I have friends I haven't talked to in 2, 3 years, and they pop up on Facebook, and it's like I always consider it like you're playing a board game with your child one night and you didn't pick it up for a few days kind of thing. When you pick back up, the pieces are all the same, and
Mhm.
you're just picking up where you left off. And I think
Right.
those are beautiful people to have in your life. Those are the ones that are there thick and thin. Doesn't matter
Mhm.
what happens. Your tribe is your tribe.
Yeah, the ones you could call in the middle of the night in an emergency and they would be there and they wouldn't be like, well, I'm not sure if I can do that. They just show up.
Yeah, and that's, I will say, on my journey and my experience, it's been rare to find people like that for me. But I started to learn, this happened to me when I lost my son. I don't know what got into me when I left the hospital that day. I was at a traffic light and I was really fuming angry over the loss of my son. Something got clear in my head that day, and that was one of the things that went through my head at this traffic light. This all happened in a split, 2-second window.
Mhm.
And one of the questions that popped in my head that was like a voice said, who are the people you're surrounding yourself with in your life right now? Are they supportive of you? Do they disempower you? Do they listen to you? Do they understand you? Would they, do they do anything to help you out in this situation? I will share this with everybody just in full honesty and transparency. 85% of people that run my life weren't those people. There was a very, very small amount of people that would be there. And so that's not to say, by the way, the 85% are bad people. It doesn't mean that. What it means
Right.
is that those people aren't meant to be on my path, and that's okay. But when
Mhm.
you focus on that 15% that is always there for you and has your back when you live there, when you're going through grief or trauma. And those guys, like you said, Don, will answer the phone at midnight if you call them, or if you have something happen, they'll be there for you. When you
Right.
build and focus on those people, it can help you break away from a lot of the hard anger emotions and a lot of the negativity that can come out of those things,
Mhm.
because those people will lift you up. They will be there to say, I know it's hard. And one of my favorite phrases that comes up sometimes when I do talk to people and they want to be acknowledged is I'll say, that sucks. And that just giving that acknowledgement that they
Mhm.
need to hear in that moment, giving them that
Right.
acknowledgement. And when you've got people like that can come along and say, that sucks. And you know what? I'm here for you. How can I
Mhm.
support you? Those people take you out of that place really quick and they get you into that emotional vulnerability. And they allow you to focus on how to move forward. And they also, by the way, say you don't have to do this alone. I'm here with you. And that's just, as somebody that's gone through grief multiple times, I can tell you that is worth its weight in gold above everything in life, is to have people that supportive around you.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, that not feeling alone piece. I mean, if you look at the statistics for suicide in this country and in the world, it's really high. And, you know, when you're feeling alone and you don't feel like you have anyone or anything to turn to that's going to help you, that's a devastating place to be. And I don't want anybody to feel like that. I want everyone to have someone that they know that they can trust, that they can rely on in their darkest hours, to surround them with their love and their compassion and their listening heart so that they choose to continue living versus the opposite.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing I've learned lately in the last month. I've worked with people that are suicidal, and I've never been around that in my life. I have not experienced that. I haven't had suicidal thoughts. I was very, very nervous working with two of these people that are in that place, because I didn't know how best I could support or how best I could help. And I've had friends that have lost people to suicide, and again, I don't know what that's like. I haven't traveled that journey. But I share that same compassion that you do, and that's why I help people in that space to the best of my abilities. Is the alternative is not good, and I don't want that for anybody. And
Yeah.
the worst thing to be in this world is isolated and alone. We're social creatures, and something I've learned on my journey, because I have had moments of my life, periods of years where I was isolated, and I can say that those are the hardest years I ever went through. But I also know that looking backwards, I had to find my tribe, as you said. I love that you said that, and I want to give hope to anybody listening today, by the way. If you are going through grief, or even if you are suicidal or had thoughts like that, I want you to know there are people out there like Dawn and I that do care, and we are a listening heart for you. And I can tell you right now, there are your people. Get out there and look for them. If you have somebody safe that you can call, somebody you can talk to, by all means do it. There's people that want to help you. And I know that, that's another thing we can wrap up on too, is, grief can feel very insurmountable. It can feel very heavy at times, and it can feel like somebody just dropped a 2-ton boulder on your head and you're not moving. it can feel like that. And so I wanted to end by asking this question to you. If there's somebody going through grief right now that's in that place and they are just having a hard time navigating that path on their own, what are like 1 to 3 tips you could share with that person that's listening to this podcast today on how to navigate that grief journey?
Number one, and we've talked about this multiple times, be emotionally honest with someone that you trust. Let someone know that you're really struggling, because just being heard and that support can give you the courage to take a step towards asking for even further help. So that's number one. Number two, I would definitely recommend, if someone is feeling just overwhelmed by grief, that they do reach out for some help from someone that, like you or me, that deals with grief and helps people navigate that journey, because it can feel very lonely. And even if we have family and friends around, if we don't have anyone who really understands grief, it can leave us with the thoughts that there's something wrong with us, when really what we're having is a normal experience. Number three, I would say, um, think about what you need for self care. All of us know that there's certain things that we can do in our lives that bring us a little bit more peace, a little bit more calm, whether it's time in nature, whether it's meditation, journaling, something like that. When you're experiencing these really difficult times, trying to continue pushing through and working and taking care of your family and, crossing things off your to-do list without taking that time for you, only makes the experience more difficult to get through. So make sure you create that time to put yourself in situations that bring you a little bit more peace.
I appreciate you sharing that, Dawn. I know that whoever listens to this is going to appreciate those tips. So I really want to thank you for that. Um, I wanted to ask today, since we're wrapping up, if you guys have enjoyed listening to Dawn today, and I have enjoyed this podcast episode myself. This has been an amazing experience with you. How can people find you?
So my website is dawnmichellejackson.com, and Michelle has one L. You can also find me on Facebook, Dawn Michelle Jackson. I'm also on LinkedIn. So those are the easiest ways to find me. All my, email and other contact information is on my website. I want to tell you thank you for having me as part of your podcast and for the work you do. We briefly touched on the issues that men deal with, that are different than women as far as grieving, and that, being taught to be strong and everything. So I want you to know that the work you do is really important. Thank you for being, a light in the world and helping people through their darkness.
Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate that. I honestly don't hear that too often, and that means a lot to me. Just thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I very much appreciate that.
You're
Um,
welcome.
And for all of our listeners today, thank you for tuning in and listening to Dawn share her perspective about grief and how to walk through that journey and navigate that in your life. I think there's a lot of content in this episode that is very, very helpful, no matter if you're in a place where you're starting your grief journey or you've been going through this for years and you just need a little bump in the road to help you navigate that journey just a little bit easier. I definitely encourage you guys to save this episode and rewatch and re-listen to it. Um, this podcast will be up on my site called Podbean. It'll also be uploaded to YouTube. On the YouTube video, I'll have Dawn's links on there so you guys can get in touch with her if you want to and give her a follow on Facebook. She's definitely been a very resourceful and just an amazing person I met on this journey. So for everybody out there today, I just want to say thank you for listening to the Empowered Grief Journey podcast. I'll be back next week with another episode. And other than that, I want to wish everybody the best on their grief journey.